Under a gray Okinawan sky on April 3, 1945, the air was thick with salt and smoke. Waves of American landing craft clawed toward the beaches of the Ryukyu Islands, their steel hulls grinding through surf churned red by weeks of bombardment. Inland, the hills were alive with hidden fire, Japanese artillery belching from caves carved deep into the limestone. Civilians, caught between two worlds, fled through sugarcane fields that whispered with shrapnel. Children clutched rice sacks. Mothers held their hands over mouths to muffle cries. Then, through the chaos, a strange order began to emerge. American medics, wearing red crosses stark against their olive drab, moved not only toward their own wounded, but toward the terrified Okinawans staggering from the smoke. It was an image that defied everything they had been taught. U.S. Marine Corps After-Action Report, April 1945. To many civilians, Americans were supposed to be monsters. Stories of cruelty and mutilation whispered through villages by Japanese propagandists. But as explosions echoed down the ridgelines of Shuri, these supposed monsters laid down rifles to bind wounds. Private First Class Eugene Ball crouched beside a Japanese girl, no older than 10, her legs shredded by mortar fragments. He gave her morphine and whispered words she didn't understand, his trembling hands stained with both enemy and ally blood. U.S. Navy Corpsman log, April 1945. Nearby, a field hospital rose from the beachhead, tent canvas flapping against wind and rain. It bore the emblem of the Red Cross, a beacon in the ruins. The Battle of Okinawa was meant to be a final stand. Japanese General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded over 100,000 defenders, supported by an army of conscripted Okinawan laborers and terrified civilians. Facing them, General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. commanded the U.S. 10th Army, 183,000 soldiers and Marines, backed by naval artillery and air supremacy. The island's fate was sealed in doctrine before the first shell landed. The Japanese would fight to the death. The Americans would crush resistance yard by yard. Neither side expected compassion to survive this equation. Imperial Japanese Army Doctrine Manual, 1944. As the front lines crawled forward, Okinawa became an open wound. Rain mixed with blood in the trenches. Artillery shook the hills day and night, pulverizing homes and shrines into dust. Thousands of civilians hid in tombs, their ancestors' resting places turned into last refuges. American flamethrowers scorched ridges. Japanese suicide charges shattered against machine gun lines. In that theater of annihilation, mercy became an act of rebellion. Pacific War Oral History, 1952. From the cliffs of Mabuni, villagers watched the sea ignite with tracer fire. Rumors spread faster than radio. The Americans were treating civilians. Some disbelieved it, thinking it a trick. Others crawled out under white cloths, clutching the wounded. One night, near the ruins of Itomen, a group of Okinawan farmers approached a U.S. medical outpost. The corpsmen hesitated only for a moment, then opened their tent. The smell of iodine and burnt flesh filled the air. By dawn, Japanese and Americans lay side by side on stretchers, breathing the same damp air, tended by hands that no longer cared about flags. U.S. Army Medical Battalion Diary, April 1945. For the Japanese command, such scenes were intolerable. Soldiers were ordered to prevent civilians from surrendering, to convince them that capture meant torture or death. But eyewitnesses tell of civilians risking execution to reach American lines. Mothers carried infants toward gunfire, trusting the Red Cross more than their own uniformed protectors. A Marine recalled an old woman bowing as he bandaged her son. "She thought I was an angel," he wrote later. "But I was just tired." Marine letter home, April 1945. The contradiction pierced the heart of the Japanese defense. Soldiers began to see their own civilians crossing over, seeking food, medicine, even safety from the Imperial Army itself. Some units, enraged, opened fire on fleeing villagers. Others simply watched in silence. Bundesarchiv, Post-War Interrogation Transcripts, 1947. The American lines, meanwhile, became sites of triage for a collapsing world. Doctors worked 16-hour shifts. Corpsmen improvised with parachute cloth and field rations. Translators were scarce. Compassion was the only universal language. One interpreter, born in Hawaii, later said, "We didn't know their names. We just knew they hurt like us." Still, the battlefield showed no mercy. The Americans advanced at a cost of nearly 50,000 casualties. grinding through fortified ridges like Shuri Castle and Sugarloaf Hill. Each meter came at the price of blood and mud. Yet behind the front, the medical tents stood as fragile islands of humanity. Reporters from Stars and Stripes described the scenes as an odd piece amid ruin. Stars and Stripes, May 1945. Nurses held crying children. Chaplains whispered prayers over bodies no longer distinguishable by uniform. By June, the battle had turned apocalyptic. Kamikaze attacks battered the U.S. fleet offshore, while inland, Japanese forces disintegrated under relentless bombardment. In the final days, with no hope of victory, hundreds of civilians jumped from cliffs rather than surrender. The Americans looked on in horror. Corpsman William Manchester, later a historian, would write, "It was not hate that filled us, it was sorrow." Manchester Memoir, 1978. Yet among the living, acts of mercy continued. Every life saved, no matter the flag, became a quiet victory against the madness consuming the island. For the Okinawan civilians who survived, the realization came slowly. These foreign soldiers, who had invaded their home with fire and steel, were also the ones giving them back their breath. They were treated before American wounded, not out of favoritism, but because medics followed triage law, the most critically injured first. It defied propaganda and reshaped perception. Many survivors later recalled that this was the first time they saw an American smile not as a conqueror, but as a healer. Okinawa Civilian Testimony Archive, 1953. By the time the guns fell silent on June 22, 1945, over 100,000 Okinawan civilians were dead, alongside 12,500 Americans and nearly the entire Japanese garrison. The island was a graveyard, but within its ashes a strange truth had taken root. Amid the horror of total war, compassion had found a foothold. It would ripple far beyond those beaches, shaping how Japan viewed its conquerors in the fragile peace that followed. But for now, as the medics worked under a rising sun, one question lingered across both sides of the line. How could such mercy exist in a place built for annihilation? The secret behind that mercy began far from the beaches of Okinawa, deep in the foundries, laboratories, and training camps of the American war machine. Compassion in war requires more than sentiment. It requires infrastructure. The U.S. military medical system in 1945 was not an improvisation. It was a triumph of logistics, engineering, and foresight. Long before medics carried stretchers through Okinawan mud, thousands of technicians, nurses, and engineers had built the invisible network that made such acts possible. U.S. Army Medical Department Historical Report, 1945. Every bandage wrapped around a wounded civilian's arm, every vial of morphine pressed into shaking hands, had traveled an astonishing path. From factories in New Jersey to forward aid stations near Naha, the lifeline spanned oceans. The U.S. Army's Quartermaster Corps had devised a system so efficient that even during the chaotic Pacific advance, medical units could operate within hours of landing. C-47 transport planes flew medical crates marked M1 Surgical Field Kit. Inside were scalpels forged by Cutler Hammer, ether bottles packed in shock-absorbing cork, and sulfur powder in tins labeled Combat Sterilization Priority. Quartermaster Procurement File. March 1945. The Japanese command had no equivalent. Their medical infrastructure, crippled by blockade and overextension, relied on limited supplies and outdated doctrine. While the Americans fielded mobile surgical hospitals capable of treating 200 patients per day, Japanese medics often lacked even clean water. Dramatized composite quote. "We used bayonets to cut cloth for bandages," a Japanese medic recalled in post-war testimony. The Americans had machines. Imperial Army Medical Division Interrogation, 1946. The hidden advantage was not merely supplies, it was communication. The Americans carried portable radios like the SCR-300, designed by Motorola engineer Don Mitchell. This FM transceiver, operating between 40 and 48 MHz, allowed medics to call in evacuation jeeps or helicopters within minutes. Each weighed roughly 38 pounds, with a range of 5 miles in hilly terrain. Technical Manual TM 11242, 1944. To a corpsman trapped behind a ridge under mortar fire, that radio meant life. It turned chaos into coordination. In Okinawa's fractured landscape, With its labyrinth of ravines and villages, this communication web stitched the battle together. Meanwhile, the Japanese relied on field runners and flares. Their doctors could not summon vehicles or reinforcements fast enough to save the wounded. Dramatized composite quote, "We bled men we could have saved if only we could speak through the air." Post-war testimony. Tokyo Medical University Archives. As the U.S. 10th Army pushed south, new tools of mercy rolled ashore. One of the most transformative was the DUKW amphibious truck, six-wheel, 6x6 drive, powered by a GMC 270 engine producing 91 horsepower. Originally designed by Sparkman and Stevens Naval Architects and the Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company, it could carry 25 casualties or 2.5 tons of cargo directly from ship to shore. On Okinawa, these ducks became floating ambulances. They ferried both soldiers and civilians from the front lines to beach hospitals without unloading stretchers. Bureau of Ships Report, 1945. This logistical miracle extended to the skies. The newly introduced L-5 Sentinel aircraft, light liaison planes with 185 HP Lycoming engines, served as aerial ambulances, capable of evacuating one litter patient from makeshift fields. Each flight reduced the fatality rate by half compared to land transport. Army Air Force's Technical Summary, June 1945. For the first time in human conflict, air evacuation became routine. The Japanese defenders, who still carried wounded men on bamboo poles through jungle ravines, could only watch in disbelief. Behind the front lines, vast medical depots sprang up like cities. Engineers of the Seabees built field hospitals from prefabricated aluminum frames within 48 hours. Generators powered sterilizers, X-ray machines, and refrigeration units for plasma. Every drop of blood carried the stamp of an industrial miracle. The American Red Cross's blood donor program, which by 1945 had processed over 13 million pints. American Red Cross Annual Review, 1945. That blood reached Okinawa in glass bottles packed in dry ice, escorted by naval convoys, and guarded as tightly as ammunition. To the medics who transfused it into Okinawan farmers, it symbolized more than science. It was proof of a nation's commitment to save life amid destruction. Japanese officers captured near Shuri Ridge could not comprehend this system. Dramatized composite quote, "We thought the Americans cared only for victory. We never imagined they would waste blood on peasants." Prisoner interrogation, Camp Atsugi, 1946. Yet this waste was deliberate. The U.S. Medical Corps followed a triage principle rooted in Geneva Convention ethics and reinforced by doctrine. The most critical patients, regardless of nationality, were treated first. Field Manual 8-10 made no distinction between friend and foe once within medical custody. Field Manual 8-10, 1943. To implement this law in battle required training, discipline, and supplies, assets Japan's crumbling empire no longer possessed. One decisive confrontation revealed how this system altered the battlefield itself. On May 16, 1945, during the assault on the Awacha Pocket, the U.S. 1st Marine Division faced entrenched Japanese units backed by 47mm anti-tank guns. When a direct hit shattered a platoon and ignited nearby civilian huts, medics raced forward under machine gun fire. Corporal Harold "Doc" Miles used an SCR 536 handheld radio, an earlier 5-pound AM unit nicknamed the Handy Talkie, to call for a DUKW extraction. Within 20 minutes, 6 wounded Marines and 4 Okinawan villagers were en route to the 383rd Field Hospital. U.S. Marine Corps After Action Report, May 1945. Japanese observers later noted with astonishment that the Americans evacuated locals and soldiers in the same vehicle. The technical backbone of that operation rested on hundreds of quiet contributions. In Detroit, the Ford Rouge plant produced 1 ambulance every 45 minutes. In Chicago, the Johnson & Johnson labs perfected sulfonamide wound powder. In California, radio engineer Marion Bond improved antenna shielding to resist tropical humidity. War Production Board Report, 1945. Their work turned theory into lifeline. While bullets and bombs defined the front page, these invisible engineers wrote the footnotes of survival. As the Okinawa campaign dragged into June, the American system adapted dynamically. When monsoon rains flooded supply roads, Engineers built pontoon causeways to move hospital trucks inland. When Japanese kamikazes destroyed the USS Comfort, a hospital ship marked with red crosses, the surviving crew continued surgeries in candlelight. Navy Medical Department Journal, 1945. Every setback became a test of ingenuity. The result was staggering. By the end of the battle, over 35,000 casualties, American, Japanese, and civilian, had been treated by U.S. medical units with a survival rate exceeding 85%. U.S. Army Statistical Review, 1946. The Japanese command could no longer match this pace of life preservation. Their hospitals collapsed under shellfire. Morphine supplies dwindled to nothing. Disease swept through caves where soldiers and civilians hid together. Our wounded begged for death, one surviving medic confessed. The Americans sent theirs home. Tokyo War Crimes Medical Testimony. 1948. By the final weeks, the pattern was unmistakable. Wherever the Americans advanced, the wounded, regardless of flag, had a chance to live. Their network of communication, transportation, and triage represented a new kind of battlefield power. Not just the ability to destroy, but to restore. It eroded fear faster than any propaganda campaign could rebuild it. Civilians who once spat at the sight of U.S. helmets now whispered a single word: sensei, teacher, healer. The moral victory had begun before the military one ended. But behind this machinery of mercy lay a darker question. Could compassion itself become a weapon? Intelligence officers noted how rapidly civilian cooperation improved once medical aid spread. Villagers offered information, guides, and shelter. Some historians later argued that every plasma transfusion was also psychological warfare, turning hearts while neutralizing resistance. U.S. Psychological Warfare Division Report, July 1945. As Okinawa burned and Tokyo awaited its fate, the battlefield had revealed a paradox. The side that mastered killing had also mastered saving. Yet this transformation was not complete. The machines of mercy built for war were about to find a new purpose when the guns fell silent. Because what happened on Okinawa did not end there. It would reshape the world's understanding of humanity in conflict and the moral legacy of American medicine for generations to come. When the final guns of Okinawa fell silent on June 22, 1945, the island was a grave of shattered cities and lost generations. Yet amid the ruins, something unexpected stirred, a fragile thread of gratitude woven through grief. The American doctors and corpsmen who had arrived as invaders left as something more complex. Healers, teachers, and, unintentionally, ambassadors of a new kind of power. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, Civilian Morale Division, 1946. In the weeks that followed, thousands of Okinawan civilians, gaunt from hunger and shock, lined up not at prisons or checkpoints, but outside field hospitals. There, under canvas tents marked with fading red crosses, the face of America was no longer a rifle. It was a stethoscope. Across Japan, word of these actions traveled faster than any leaflet drop or surrender broadcast. Survivors carried stories in trembling voices, how American medics had carried their wounded before their own, how rations had been shared, how the men who once dropped bombs now handed out penicillin. Okinawa Testimony Project, 1951. The effect was quiet but seismic. For a nation steeped in the Bushido Code, where surrender was shame and mercy a sign of weakness, these acts forced a cultural reckoning. When occupation began, many Japanese civilians approached Allied forces expecting brutality. Instead, they found order, food, and hospitals. Psychologists from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey recorded disbelief turning to respect. They had prepared us to hate, one Tokyo resident said, but the Americans rebuilt us instead. U.S. Psychological Warfare Assessment, 1946. Behind this moral inversion stood the invisible army of engineers, doctors and logisticians who had built the system that made compassion operational. In warehouses across the Pacific, field hospitals transformed into rehabilitation centers. Army medics trained Japanese nurses, teaching them to use plasma kits and sterilization techniques. American doctors lectured in Tokyo University classrooms, still missing their roofs. Army Medical Corps Rehabilitation Report, 1946. For the first time in modern warfare, medical infrastructure became a tool of reconstruction. It wasn't conquest through steel. but through care. Strategically, this shift paid dividends beyond imagination. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, quickly realized the power of what his staff called the medicine of peace. By reopening hospitals, distributing vaccines, and deploying mobile medical teams to rural Japan, the occupation forces prevented epidemics that could have destabilized post-war governance. GHQ SCAP Health and Welfare Division Report 1947. Death rates plummeted within months. Infant mortality dropped by half. The Japanese people, once convinced that surrender would mean annihilation, began to associate the American flag with survival. Yet for the men who had lived through Okinawa, the transformation was more personal. Corpsman Harold Miles, the same medic who'd radioed for help amid mortar fire, returned to the island in 1946. He found the same village he'd once fought through, now rebuilding around a new American field clinic. They remembered, he wrote in his diary. Not the battle, but the bandages. Miles' diary. 1946. In that recognition lay the quiet victory no general had planned, the conquest of fear itself. Still, the legacy of mercy was not without paradox. Some historians argue that humanitarianism became another arm of American power. Soft influence built upon hard conquest. Post-war policy analysis, Rand, 1953. By feeding, healing, and rebuilding, the United States not only pacified Japan, but reshaped it culturally. The very ethics that once drove wartime compassion became the moral foundation of post-war diplomacy. But to the survivors of Okinawa, these motives mattered less than the outcome. They had seen both faces of war, one that destroyed and one that healed. In military doctrine, the experience of Okinawa altered the calculus of future conflicts. The Korean War, just 5 years later, saw the full integration of forward surgical units, mobile, radio-linked, and equipped with the same blood supply chains first tested in the Pacific. Army Surgical Unit Report 1951. By the Vietnam era, the principle of rapid medical evacuation, first attempted with L-5 aircraft on Okinawa, had evolved into the helicopter medevac systems that saved tens of thousands of lives. The concept that compassion could be systematized, industrialized, even became an enduring lesson of the American military machine. On a psychological level, the events of Okinawa reshaped how both nations viewed war itself. Japanese civilians who witnessed American doctors at work later became advocates for peace movements during the 1950s, arguing that true strength was not the power to destroy, but to restore. Japan Peace Council Archives, 1955. Meanwhile, in the United States, veterans' memoirs from the Pacific began to dwell less on enemy hatred and more on shared suffering. The line between soldier and civilian blurred in the blood, one Marine wrote. We learned that the enemy hurts the same way we do. Marine Oral History Collection, 1962. Even decades later, the legacy lingered in quiet gestures. On Okinawa, where concrete memorials now line the cliffs of Mabuni, villagers still tend to graves marked with both American and Japanese names. Schools teach the story of the doctors of the Red Cross Beach, where compassion defied command. Okinawa Prefectural Museum Record, 1978. For them, the lesson was not about victory or defeat. It was about the rare moments when humanity triumphed over orders. Engineers and scientists, too, carried forward the invisible spirit of that campaign. The radios that once called for evacuations became the prototypes for modern emergency response systems. The blood refrigeration units inspired post-war innovations in civilian healthcare. Even the humble DUKW amphibious truck, designed for war, would later be repurposed for flood rescues and disaster relief. National Transportation Research Board, 1957. In every way, the technology of destruction had birthed tools for salvation. The moral weight of this transformation left an imprint on generations of military planners. The concept of humanitarian logistics, now a cornerstone of NATO and UN operations, can trace its lineage back to those muddy Okinawan beaches. Defense Humanitarian Aid Review, 1983. What began as a tactical necessity became a strategic doctrine. Control the battlefield through mercy as much as through might. Yet beneath the layers of history and theory lies the most human truth of all, the simple defiance of one medic kneeling beside an enemy child, In that moment, stripped of uniform, language, and ideology, war revealed its rarest face. Mercy was not strategy. It was instinct. It was survival of the soul. As the sun rose over Okinawa's ruins in July 1945, the smell of smoke still clung to the air, but the sound had changed. No longer the thunder of guns, just the rhythmic hum of generators powering field hospitals. Inside, American and Japanese wounded lay in rows, breathing in unison. A nurse adjusted a bandage on a man whose uniform she couldn't read anymore. Nearby, a child stirred and smiled. A war fought for dominance had ended by teaching both sides the meaning of humanity. And from that revelation, a new world was born, one where mercy itself had become a weapon, and compassion the most enduring victory of all.